I stood in the sweltering heat of the driveway, clutching a single trash bag filled with the only life I had left, while my husband's mother tossed a handful of gravel at my feet. Through the polished glass of our suburban home, I saw my husband Julian watching, not with sadness, but with a cold, clinical embarrassment. He didn't come out to stop her. He didn't even say goodbye. All he did was pull the blinds shut, erasing me from his perfect world because I wasn't refined enough to walk beside him. I was 8 months pregnant, homeless, and according to them, completely worthless. I realized then that my love hadn't been a partnership, it had been a hostage situation. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Before the gravel and the locked doors, there was a different kind of sacrifice, one built on the quiet lie that his future was worth more than mine. For 3 years, Elena's life was a cycle of dawn and midnight. She woke up at 4 in the morning to prep for her shift at the local diner. By the time most people were finishing lunch, she was already heading to her second job cleaning office buildings downtown. Her feet ached and her back throbbed, but she never complained. Every dollar she earned, every tip she carefully tucked into a jar, went toward Julian's tuition. He was the star of his prestigious MBA program, the man everyone said was going places. Elena believed in that dream. She believed that when he reached the top, they would be there together. After all, she was the one who had dropped out of her own graduate program to ensure he could study full-time. Julian spent his days in air-conditioned lecture halls, networking with the sons of CEOs and discussing high-level finance. When he came home, Elena would have dinner ready, despite having worked 12 hours on her feet. She thought they were a team. She thought her labor was an investment in their family. Even when the morning sickness began, she didn't slow down. She worked through the nausea and the exhaustion of the first and second trimesters, driven by the thought of the life they would provide for their child. Julian would pat her stomach and smile, but as his graduation approached, the smiles became more distant. He started looking at Elena's worn uniforms and tired eyes, with a flicker of something that looked like pity but felt like contempt. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon. Elena had finished her shift early because of a sharp pain in her hip. She walked into their home to find her mother-in-law, Beatrice, sitting at the dining table with a stack of folders. Beatrice had never liked Elena. To her, Elena was a simple girl from a background that lacked the pedigree required for the Whitmore name. Julian was standing by the window, looking out at the neighborhood he now felt he had outgrown. The atmosphere was thick with a calculated, heavy silence. Beatrice didn't even offer a greeting. She simply tapped the mahogany table and told Elena to sit down for a family meeting. Beatrice began by listing Julian's recent accomplishments. He had received a lucrative offer from a top-tier private equity firm. The salary was astronomical, but the expectations were even higher. In that world, Beatrice said, her voice dripping with artificial grace, an executive's wife is his calling card. She must be refined. She must have the right connections and the right image. Julian remained silent, refusing to look Elena in the eye. He finally spoke, his voice cold and flat. He told her the firm expected a certain type of spouse to represent them at galas and board meetings. He suggested that Elena didn't fit that mold. She was too simple, too scarred by the service work she had done to elevate him. The betrayal was swift. Julian explained that he had already secured a new apartment downtown, one that Elena was not invited to. He told her he had found a companion more suitable for his new status, a woman from his program who understood the lifestyle. Beatrice then handed Elena a single trash bag and told her she had 30 minutes to clear her things. Elena stood there, 8 months pregnant, feeling the weight of the child she had carried while scrubbing floors for his career. She looked at the husband she had funded, the man who had climbed to success on her bruised back, and saw only a stranger. As Elena struggled to the door, her hands trembling as she held her meager belongings, Beatrice followed her out to the driveway. She mocked Elena's background one last time, calling her a leech who had tried to trap her son with a pregnancy. Julian watched through the window, his expression one of clinical detachment, before he reached out and pulled the blinds. He left his wife in the heat, ignoring the vows they had made and the loyalty she had shown. Elena walked to the edge of the street, her heart breaking for the daughter she was about to bring into a world where she was now entirely alone. As she reached for her phone to call for a ride, she opened her banking app to check her balance. Her breath caught in her throat. The emergency fund, the thousands of dollars she had saved from 3 years of extra shifts and hidden tips, was gone. The balance read 0. Julian hadn't just left her. He had robbed her of the very safety net she had built with her own sweat and tears. He had taken everything, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back, and a future that looked as dark as the shadows falling over the driveway. Elena collapsed onto a weathered bench at the bus stop, her legs finally giving out under the crushing weight of betrayal. The humid air felt like a physical barrier, making every breath an agonizing struggle. She stared at her phone screen, the zero balance in her savings account mocking the years she had spent scrubbing floors and clearing tables. Julian hadn't just discarded her like a piece of unrefined trash. He had systematically stripped her of every resource she needed to survive. Tears blurred her vision as she realized she was 8 months pregnant and had less than $20 in her pocket. "Elena, is that really you?" A soft, concerned voice broke through the fog of her despair. Elena looked up to see Sarah, a woman she hadn't seen in nearly 4 years. Sarah had been her mentor and professor back when Elena was the top student in the university's financial law program. Sarah took one look at Elena's disheveled state, the single trash bag by her side, and the prominent swell of her belly. Without asking for an explanation, she sat down and wrapped an arm around Elena's shaking shoulders. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She offered a steady presence in the middle of the storm. Safe in Sarah's guest room an hour later, the truth finally poured out. Elena spoke of the graduate degree she had abandoned because Julian convinced her his path was the only one that mattered for their future. She admitted how she had shrunk her own identity to fit into the small, manageable space he allowed her to occupy. Sarah listened with a grim expression, her eyes sparking with a quiet fury. "He didn't just take your money, Elena," Sarah said firmly. "He tried to take your fire. But I remember the woman who could dismantle a complex hedge fund merger in 10 minutes. She's still in there. The kindness was a lifeline, but the reality of the United States legal system was a cold wake-up call." The next morning, a process server tracked Elena down at Sarah's address. Julian had moved with terrifying speed. The paperwork was thick and cold. He was officially filing for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and Elena's alleged mental instability during the pregnancy. He was positioning himself to be the victim, a successful executive burdened by an unstable, unrefined wife. It was a calculated move to ensure he wouldn't have to pay a dime more than the bare minimum in support. Elena gripped the legal documents until the edges crumpled in her hands. The humiliation of the driveway was being replaced by a sharp, cold clarity. Sarah sat across from her at the kitchen table, sliding a laptop toward her. "You have two choices," Sarah whispered. "You can let his narrative become your reality, or you can finish what you started before he convinced you that you were small." Elena looked at the screen, then at the scholarship notification Sarah had pulled up. Her old department had reached out months ago, unaware of her situation. The fire Julian thought he had extinguished flickered back to life deep in Elena's chest. She realized then that dignity wasn't something Julian could take away. It was something she had stopped giving herself. She reached for the laptop, her fingers steady for the first time in weeks. But as she began to type her response to the university, a new email notification popped up at the top of the screen. It was an automated alert from a local real estate registry. Julian hadn't just moved into a new apartment. He had listed their suburban home for sale, and the cosigner listed on the new luxury penthouse wasn't his mother. The name on the deed belonged to someone who had been Julian's study partner during the very MBA program Elena had funded with her sweat and blood. The like the city hospital hummed with a cold, indifferent energy as Elena labored alone. She clutched the thin rails of the delivery bed, her knuckles white, her breath coming in ragged hitches. Julian hadn't answered any of her calls, and his mother had blocked Elena's number weeks ago. When the nurse asked if there was anyone to call, Elena simply shook her head and focused on the rhythmic beat of the heart monitor. It was just her and the life she was fighting to bring into a world that had already tried to discard them. The birth of her daughter Maya was not the soft, celebrated moment she had once imagined. There were no flowers, no proud father in the hallway, and no celebratory social media posts. Instead, the only visitor Elena received was a sharp-suited paralegal who arrived 12 hours after the delivery. He didn't offer congratulations. He offered a manila envelope. Inside was a standard child support proposal that wouldn't even cover the cost of a month's worth of diapers in their city. Julian was treating their daughter like a line item he was trying to minimize on a corporate balance sheet. The sting of that envelope was followed by a more direct assault on Elena's dignity. A few days later, Beatrice called Sarah's landline, her voice dripping with a predatory sweetness that made Elena's skin crawl. She offered a lump sum payment, 6 figures, on the condition that Elena sign over all parental rights and disappear. Beatrice claimed she wanted Julian to have a clean slate to start his high society life with Chloe, without the baggage of his past. Elena looked at Maya, sleeping peacefully in a second-hand bassinet, and felt a surge of protective fury. She realized then that Julian hadn't just failed as a husband. He was abdicating his soul as a father. Elena's recovery became a masterclass in endurance. She spent her days working a low-level clerical job at a local logistics firm, filing papers until her eyes blurred. At night, while Maya slept, Elena sat at Sarah's kitchen table, surrounded by thick textbooks and financial law journals. She used every spare cent from her paycheck and her meager savings to enroll in the night classes required to finish her degree. The exhaustion was a heavy cloak she wore every day, but the fire of ambition kept her moving. She wasn't just studying for a degree anymore. She was studying for a reckoning. As the months turned into years, Elena's transformation began to take a physical and professional shape. She grew sharper, her mind a honed blade capable of cutting through the complex corporate structures that Julian now hid behind. She followed his career from a distance, watching him climb the ladder at his new firm, always standing beside Chloe, the woman whose family fortune was the only reason Julian was relevant. But one evening, while digging through a public financial audit for a class project, Elena found something that made her heart skip a beat. The firm Julian had just joined was deep in negotiations for a massive merger, but the numbers didn't add up. Behind the polished press releases and Julian's confident public image, the company was hemorrhaging cash and masking it with illegal offshore transfers. Elena realized she had found the billionaire's secret that could bring Julian's entire house of cards crashing down. She closed her laptop, a cold smile finally touching her lips, and picked up her phone to call a specific recruiter. She wasn't just looking for any job. She was targeting the one firm that had the power to audit Julian's future out of existence. Elena stepped through the glass doors of Sterling & Associates, her heels clicking with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. The lobby was a cathedral of steel and white marble, designed to make everyone who entered feel small. But Elena didn't feel small. She wore her maiden name, Elena Vance, like armor. To the recruiters, she was a brilliant financial law graduate with an uncanny ability to spot institutional rot. To the corporate world, she was a ghost. She had spent years preparing for this walk, transforming her simple background into a strategic weapon that the ivory tower elites never saw coming. Her new role as a senior analyst in the mergers and acquisitions department gave her access to the internal plumbing of the city's biggest players. She worked longer hours than anyone, her mind fueled by the memory of that gravel hitting her feet. While her colleagues focused on surface-level profits, Elena mastered vulnerability mapping. She understood the working class, the service industries, and the logistics chains because she had lived them. This unique perspective allowed her to see through the inflated valuations and billionaire secrets that high society firms used to mask their failures. It didn't take long for her to find what she was looking for. Julian's firm, the one that had deemed her a stain on their image, was moving toward a massive merger. Julian was the lead executive, the golden boy whose career rested entirely on this deal going through. But as Elena dug into the spreadsheets, she realized the firm was dangerously over-leveraged. They were hiding millions in toxic debt through a series of shell companies. Julian wasn't just working hard. He was presiding over a house of cards that was one strong breeze away from a total collapse. Dignity, Elena realized, was a quiet power. It wasn't about the designer bags Chloe carried or the penthouse Julian lived in. It was about the ability to stand in the truth when everyone else was lying. She sat in her dark office late one Friday night, the glow of the monitor illuminating the proof of Julian's professional negligence. She felt a surge of empathy for the hundreds of employees whose pensions were tied to this failing merger, people like her old self, working 2 jobs just to survive. Julian was gambling with their lives to fund his social ascent. The escalation of her plan was now inevitable. Because of her exceptional performance, Elena was chosen for a specialized task force. Her boss, a man who valued results over pedigree, called her into his office on Monday morning. "Elena, we need our best eyes on the final audit for the mid-year merger negotiations," he said, sliding a thick file across the desk. "You'll be heading the audit team representing the interests of the primary creditors." Elena opened the file and saw Julian's name listed as the lead representative for the opposing side. For the first time in years, she felt a cold, sharp thrill. The meeting was set for the following morning. Julian thought he was walking into a routine negotiation to secure his future, but he had no idea that the woman appointed to judge his success was the same wife he had erased from his life. As Elena prepared her opening statements, a notification from her private investigator flashed on her phone. Julian had just authorized an illegal transfer of $5 million to a Caribbean account in Chloe's name. The air in the glass-walled boardroom was thin and cold. Elena stood by the window, watching the city traffic crawl below. She wore a sharp, tailored charcoal suit that felt like a suit of armor. Behind her, the door clicked open. Julian walked in, flanked by his legal team and a woman Elena recognized as Chloe. Julian looked every bit the high society executive, his face radiating an air of unearned superiority. He began spreading his documents across the mahogany table, not even glancing at the woman standing in the shadows. He saw only a figure of authority from the primary creditor firm, a professional obstacle he intended to charm or intimidate. "Good morning," Julian said, his voice smooth and practiced. "We're here to finalize the merger and prove that our assets are as robust as our reputation." He finally looked up, ready to offer a condescending smile. The smile died instantly. He froze, his hand tightening around a leather-bound folder. Elena turned slowly to face him. The silence in the room became heavy and suffocating. She didn't look like the woman who had begged for her dignity in a dusty driveway. She looked like a judge. Elena let the pause stretch until Julian's breathing became audible. She saw the confusion in his eyes turn into a flickering, desperate recognition. Julian's boss stepped forward, oblivious to the history between them. "Julian, I'd like you to meet the head of the audit team, Elena Vance." Julian's throat moved as he swallowed hard. He tried to speak, but the words seemed stuck. Chloe leaned in, her designer perfume filling the space between them. She looked at Elena with a frown, sensing the shift in the room's energy. "Is there a problem, Julian?" she asked, her voice sharp with a socialite's impatience. Julian managed a weak nod, but he couldn't take his eyes off Elena. He was looking at a ghost who had returned to haunt his future. Elena ignored his shock. She opened her laptop and pulled up the first spreadsheet of the audit. "Let's keep this professional," she said, her voice like ice. "I've reviewed the internal plumbing of your firm, Julian. The numbers you presented last month don't match the reality of your toxic debt." For the next 20 minutes, she dismantled his legal arguments. She showed no mercy, pointing out the inflated valuations he had signed off on. She spoke with a clarity that left his team scrambling for excuses. Julian sat there, forced to listen to the unrefined woman he had discarded explain the flaws in his own ambition. As the meeting moved into a brief recess, Julian followed Elena into the hallway. He checked to make sure his bosses were out of earshot. "How did you do this?" he hissed, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and fear. "You were a waitress, Elena. You're supposed to be in a one-bedroom apartment somewhere, not standing here trying to ruin me." Elena stopped and turned to him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I was never just a waitress, Julian. I was the person funding your life while you forgot how to be a human being. Arrogance made you blind, and now, that blindness is going to cost you everything." Just as Julian opened his mouth to retaliate, his phone buzzed with an urgent notification. It was a message from his firm's security department. Simultaneously, Elena's phone lit up with a video feed from her private investigator. Beatrice, Julian's mother, was currently at the firm's lobby, causing a scene and demanding to see the head auditor. Elena looked at Julian, a cold, satisfied thrill running through her. She was about to show him that respect isn't found in a penthouse, it's earned in the fire. The elevator dings echoed in the hallway as security guards approached Julian, informing him that the board had just requested an emergency meeting regarding his personal offshore transfers. Julian paced the restricted corridor of the executive wing, his breathing shallow and jagged. The emergency board meeting was already convening behind heavy oak doors, and for the first time in his life, his charm was failing him. He looked at Elena, who stood by the elevators, her expression as unmovable as granite. He had spent years convinced she was a footnote in his success story, a simple girl who didn't possess the mental capacity to match his upward trajectory. Seeing her now, holding the audit that proved his professional fraud, shattered his sense of reality. "You're bluffing," he rasped, though his trembling hands gave him away. "You were just a waitress. You don't have the connections to pull off an audit of this scale." Elena adjusted the strap of her laptop bag, her movements slow and deliberate. She thought of the nights she had spent nursing Maya with one hand while highlighting legal briefs with the other. She thought of the self-respect she had rebuilt, dollar by hard-earned dollar, while he was busy buying a life he couldn't afford. "Arrogance is a terminal disease in finance, Julian," she said, her voice quiet but carrying through the hall. "You thought my labor was beneath you, so you never bothered to check if I was learning while I worked. You assumed I was empty because I was serving you. That was your mistake. I wasn't just a waitress. I was your silent partner, and I've come to collect my share." The elevator doors chimed, and Beatrice burst into the hallway, her face a mask of frantic indignance. She ignored Elena at first, rushing to Julian's side. "Julian, the bank is calling!" "They're asking about the house proceeds and those transfers to the Caribbean," she hissed, her voice dropping as she finally noticed the woman standing near them. Beatrice froze, her eyes widening as she recognized the unrefined girl she had tossed gravel at years ago. The silence was absolute. Beatrice looked at Elena's designer suit, her professional poise, and the badge that identified her as the lead auditor. "You," Beatrice breathed, the word dripping with a newfound, icy fear. Elena didn't offer the satisfaction of an emotional outburst. Instead, she offered a humanitarian lesson in consequences. "Dignity isn't something you inherit, Beatrice. And it's certainly not something you can throw out with a trash bag," Elena said, looking her mother-in-law in the eye. "I'm here to do my job. The board is waiting for the report on the $5 million Julian siphoned from the creditors' fund." She turned back toward the boardroom, leaving them both standing in the cold light of the hallway. She realized then that healing didn't come from hurting them. It came from the fact that they no longer had the power to make her feel small. Inside the boardroom, the tension was a physical weight. The chairman of the firm looked at Elena, then at Julian, who had followed her in, looking like a man walking toward his own execution. "Ms. Vance," the chairman said, "we've reviewed your preliminary findings regarding the shell companies. Do you have the final confirmation of the offshore destination?" Elena opened her screen, projecting a document that made the room gasp. The money hadn't just gone to Chloe. It had been routed through a trust fund that Beatrice had set up decades ago to hide a much darker family secret. As the chairman leaned forward to examine the signature, Elena's phone vibrated with a text from her investigator. "Chloe isn't who they think she is. Check the birth records I just sent." The birth records Elena clutched in the quiet of her office felt heavier than the millions of dollars she was auditing. They weren't just names and dates. They were the blueprints of a 30-year-old lie. Julian had always claimed his family pedigree was a closed loop of excellence, but the document in Elena's hand proved that the perfect Whitmore lineage was built on an act of cold-blooded desperation. Chloe, the woman Julian was prepared to marry for her unmatched connections, wasn't the biological daughter of the Cartwright empire. She was the child of a domestic worker Beatrice had quietly paid off decades ago to ensure the Cartwrights had an heir to anchor a business alliance. Elena sat back, the dim glow of her desk lamp casting long shadows across the evidence. She felt a strange surge of empathy for Chloe, another woman Beatrice had viewed as a commodity to be managed and traded. This wasn't just about Julian's greed anymore. It was about a family that treated human lives like line items on a balance sheet. Elena thought of Maya sleeping safely at Sarah's house. She realized that by discarding Elena for being unrefined, Beatrice and Julian had unknowingly protected Maya from being sucked into their cycle of dehumanization. The next morning, the board meeting resumed with a funereal atmosphere. Julian looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. His charcoal suit, once a symbol of his power, now hung loosely on his frame. Elena didn't look at him with hatred. She looked at him with the clinical detachment of an expert witness. She began her presentation by detailing the offshore transfers, but as she reached the final slide, she paused. She watched Beatrice, who sat in the back of the room, her chin high, still clutching the illusion of her family's superiority. "Dignity is a fragile thing when it's bought," Elena said, her voice cutting through the hum of the air conditioner. "Julian, you signed off on these transfers to a trust fund you thought was your ticket to the Cartwright fortune, but you failed to audit the one person you trusted most." Elena projected the birth certificate alongside Beatrice's signature on the trust documents. The chairman leaned forward, his face turning a deep, mottled red. The Cartwright alliance, the very foundation of the firm's survival, began to crumble in real time as the board realized their pedigreed partner was the center of a monumental fraud. Beatrice stood up, her voice a shrill, desperate command. "This is a fabrication. This girl is a vengeful liar," but the room remained silent. Julian looked from his mother to the screen, the realization of his own obsolescence finally hitting him. He had traded his wife and child for a lie, and now even the lie was leaving him. Elena closed her laptop, her self-respect finally restored not by their ruin, but by her own refusal to be a victim. As she walked toward the door, a security guard stopped her. "Ms. Vance, there's a man in the lobby. He says he has the original Cartwright ledgers, and he's been waiting for you to finish." The man waiting in the lobby was Elias, retired private investigator Sarah had recommended years ago. He stood with a weathered leather satchel gripped in his hands, his eyes sharp with the victory of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. As Elena stepped out of the elevator, he didn't say a word. He simply handed her a thick, yellowed ledger. It was the original record of the Cartwright household's private payroll from 3 decades ago. Elena opened it to a marked page and felt the final piece of the puzzle click into place. It was a receipt for a private medical procedure and a non-disclosure agreement signed by Beatrice Whitmore. Elena returned to the boardroom where the silence was so thick it felt like a physical weight. Julian was slumped in his chair, staring at the floor, while Beatrice was frantically whispering to the firm's senior counsel. Elena walked to the head of the table and placed the ledger directly in front of the chairman. "This isn't about a merger anymore," Elena said, her voice steady and resonant. "This is about the systematic exploitation of a woman who had no voice. Beatrice didn't just find an heir for the Cartwrights. She stole a child to secure a business alliance. And she used a Whitmore name to bury the truth." The chairman's eyes scanned the entries in the ledger, his face draining of all color. The legal implications were catastrophic: human trafficking, identity fraud, and a decades-long conspiracy to defraud investors. He looked at Julian, then at Beatrice, his expression shifting from shock to a cold, professional disgust. "The merger is dead," he announced, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "And as of this moment, Julian Whitmore, your employment and your partnership stake are terminated for cause. We will be conducting a full internal investigation into every document you've signed." Beatrice lunged toward the table, her hand catching on a crystal water pitcher, sending it crashing to the floor. The sound of shattering glass mirrored the collapse of her carefully curated world. "You can't do this," she shrieked at Elena. "You're a nobody. You have no pedigree." Elena stood her ground, looking down at the woman who had once tossed gravel at her feet. "Pedigree is just a word people like you use to hide their lack of character," Elena replied. "Dignity can't be bought, Beatrice. It's built in the shifts you think are beneath you. It's built in the classrooms you thought I didn't belong in." Julian finally looked up, his eyes hollow and defeated. He saw the woman he had discarded, the mother of the child he had tried to erase, and he finally realized that she was the only real thing he had ever had. But before he could utter a single word of apology, the heavy doors of the boardroom swung open. 4 uniformed officers from the Financial Crimes Unit entered the room. They weren't there for Julian. They walked straight past him and stopped directly in front of Beatrice, pulling out a set of steel handcuffs. As the officers began to read Beatrice her rights, a new notification flashed on the projected screen behind Elena. It was an incoming wire transfer alert for the trust fund, but the source wasn't the Caribbean. The transfer was being initiated from an account that had been dormant for 25 years, the personal account of Chloe's biological mother. The message attached to the transfer read, "The truth is finally free. Check the basement of the old lake house." The boardroom felt like a tomb as the heavy doors clicked shut behind the departing officers. Julian remained slumped in his chair, a shell of the man who had walked in that morning. He stared at the spot where his mother had been standing, but all he could see was the reflection of his own failure in the polished mahogany table. He had built his entire identity on a foundation of unearned prestige and his mother's ruthless manipulations. Now both were gone. Elena stood at the head of the table, methodically closing her laptop and organizing her files. She didn't feel the rush of adrenaline she had expected. Instead, she felt a quiet, grounding peace. She had walked back into the fire that once burned her and emerged with her dignity fully intact. "Elena," Julian rasped, his voice barely a whisper. She didn't look up, but she stopped moving. "Did you know? About Chloe? About what my mother did?" Elena finally met his eyes, and the lack of anger in her gaze seemed to disturb him more than any shouting match could. She realized that for years she had sought his validation, only to find it was a currency that held no value. "I knew enough to follow the paper trail, Julian," she said softly. "But the real question is why you didn't. You were so busy looking down at everyone else that you forgot to look at the ground beneath your own feet." She saw a flicker of genuine shame in him, a human reaction he had suppressed for far too long. The chairman of the firm cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "Miss Vance, your audit has saved this firm from a catastrophic legal and financial alliance. We will be in contact regarding the restitution of the funds," Julian siphoned. He looked at Julian with an expression that made it clear he was now a liability. Elena nodded professionally, knowing that the legal process would now take over. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about ensuring that the systems meant to protect people like her were finally working. She left the room without a second glance, her heels echoing a rhythm of liberation as she headed for the elevators. As she reached the lobby, her phone buzzed with the message her investigator had promised. It was a location pin for a forgotten lake house in the northern part of the state. The ledger had mentioned it as the site where Chloe's mother had been hidden decades ago. Elena knew that if she could find her, she could give Chloe the one thing Beatrice had stolen from her, the truth of her own origins. Healing, Elena understood, required more than just punishing the guilty. It required restoring the stolen identities of the innocent. She hailed a cab, her mind already racing through the implications of what she might find at that secluded property. The sun was setting as the cab pulled away from the corporate tower. Elena looked at the picture of Maya on her lock screen, a reminder of the future she was building. She felt a profound sense of responsibility to end this cycle of secrets before her daughter grew old enough to feel its weight. But as the cab merged into traffic, a black sedan began to follow them, keeping a steady distance through every turn. Elena's phone rang. It was Sarah. "Elena, get out of there now. I just got word that Julian's mother wasn't the only one involved. There's a third signature on those trafficking receipts, and he's not in handcuffs yet." The morning sun over the city was golden and warm, a stark contrast to the biting cold of that night years ago. Elena sat in her corner office, her fingers tracing the glass edge of a plaque on her desk. It was the Charter for the Simple Truth, a foundation she had spent the last 2 years building. It was designed to provide full scholarships and legal support for marginalized women pursuing professional degrees. She knew what it was like to be dismissed as empty because of the uniform she wore. She knew the weight of a brilliant mind hidden behind a serving tray. This foundation was her way of ensuring that other women wouldn't have to wait for an audit to prove their value. Maya, now 6 years old, sat on the plush rug in the corner of the office, coloring with a focus that reminded Elena of herself. The girl was growing up in a world of absolute respect and transparency. She didn't know the names of the people who had tried to erase her existence, and Elena intended to keep it that way for as long as possible. Dignity was Maya's birthright now, not a commodity to be traded for family approval. Elena watched her daughter and realized that the cycle of dehumanization had finally been broken. The Whitmore name was a ghost in their lives, a lesson learned and then set aside. A courier arrived later that afternoon with a single thick envelope. It was postmarked from the state penitentiary, the handwriting on the front jagged and desperate. Julian had been writing for months, his letters growing more frantic as his appeals were denied one by one. He was serving 15 years for his role in the Cartwright fraud and the siphoning of creditor funds. Elena held the letter in her hand, feeling the thinness of the paper. She didn't need to read his apologies or his explanations. She knew Julian now better than he had ever known himself. He didn't miss her or the child. He missed the life that her hard work had made possible. She walked over to the small decorative fireplace in her office and dropped the unopened letter into the embers. She watched the paper curl and blacken, the secrets and the lies turning into harmless ash. This was her final act of liberation. She didn't need his remorse to feel whole, and she didn't need his confession to know she was right. True healing didn't come from a man's apology. It came from the silence of no longer caring if he spoke at all. She felt a profound sense of peace as the last flame died out. She was no longer a character in Julian's story. She was the architect of her own. Later that evening, Elena drove Maya to the quiet, tree-lined street where the old Whitmore estate once stood. The mansion had been seized and liquidated as part of the restitution for the Cartwright victims. Elena parked the car at the edge of the long driveway, the same spot where Beatrice had once tossed a bag of gravel at her feet and told her she didn't belong. Now, the entire block was different. Elena hadn't just bought the house. Her firm had acquired the surrounding development rights. She stood on the pavement, holding Maya's hand, looking up at the sprawling grounds. "Is this where you used to work, Mommy?" Maya asked, squinting against the sunset. Elena smiled, a real grounding smile that reached her eyes. "This is where I learned that some people can't see the gold, even when it's right in front of them, Maya," she said softly. Elena realized then that her success wasn't about the title of CEO or the balance in her bank account. It was about standing in this driveway and knowing that she owned the very ground that once rejected her. She had reclaimed her life by refusing to let others define her worth. If Elena's journey to reclaiming her dignity moved you, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to know their worth is not determined by those who fail to see it. Your thoughts and stories of transformation are important to us, so leave a comment below. Subscribe to Vengeful Hearts for more stories of justice and resilience.